Hello and welcome to Global Order. My name is Ishan Dhar. Joining me today is a very special guest. Ambassador Dilip Sinha is a distinguished former diplomat who served as India's permanent representative to the United Nations. However, more recently, he has been celebrated for his scholarly endeavors. Today, we are discussing his most recent contribution, Imperial Games in Tibet, The Struggle for Statehood and Sovereignty, published earlier this year by Macmillan. In this book, through extensive archival research, Ambassador Sinha traces the history of the world's apathy towards Tibet. The book particularly focuses on the Great Game in Central Asia and traces the history of Tibet's plight into contemporary times. Join us to learn more about the makings of a tragedy and why this conversation matters. Ambassador Sinha, thank you very much for your time. We're eagerly looking forward to this. To start off with, one has to ask, what prompted you to write a geopolitical history of Tibet?
Well, I've been in the foreign service, so I've always been interested in international affairs. Uh, I never dealt with China in the course of my career, but I've always been interested in the India-China dispute and India-China relations. And one of the things that bugged me a lot was that whatever books I picked up on India-China relations or on the India-China border dispute, these books took China's claim on the border for granted. They won't question them. Whereas India's claim would always be scrutinized with very fine-tooth comb and then very critically examined, and faults would be found in it. And then they would say, okay, India's claim is weak, therefore China's claim is correct. And I felt that, after all, China's claim to come to the border emanates from China's claim to Tibet. So, what is China's claim to Tibet? And how does Tibet look at itself? What has been Tibet's history? So, I realized that Tibet as a factor in India-China relations has been completely ignored by us to our detriment, because we have kind of lost our trump card in this whole thing. That the most critical issue is Tibet. And when we discuss anything with China, we forget that for the Chinese, at the back of their mind is Tibet, whereas we ignore it completely and we pretend it doesn't exist. So I decided that I would look into the history of Tibet, and I started reading about it. And that's how slowly my ideas started evolving. And as I got into the, the policies of the big powers, that's when I realized that I had a thesis to propound, to project.
You just mentioned that Tibet has sort of always been at the back of China's mind. Throughout the book, you analyze in great detail, and I guess this also shows the value of archival research, Chinese interpretations of historical events, at times imperial practices. You even had an interesting section on even linguistics, particularly as a means to justify their claimed sovereignty over Tibet. At times, this almost seems like a very peculiar historiography unique to China when it comes to Tibet. Does this indicate, in your opinion, a sense of insecurity when it comes to Chinese sovereignty uh, over Tibet?
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, to add to all the other claims, China is now looking at archaeological evidence, digging up in Tibet, and any piece of stone it finds, it says, oh, this is Chinese, and therefore Tibet has been Chinese. You see, Chinese historians themselves do not agree upon when Tibet became a part of China. And if you look at Chinese official records, even today, there's this paper that China released in 1959, a white paper, then another in 1992, and there have been several others. But the one in 1992 is very important because that's the paper that they have put up on their website uh, of their permanent mission in New York. Now, if you look at these claims, they say that China became Tibet became a part of China during the Mongol period. Now, if you read other historians, they say Tibet became a part of China during the Manchu period, which is a good 500 years later. Now, if you look at the tweets of the Chinese embassy in Delhi in recent times, you find that China claims that Tibet has been part of China since ancient times. So this period keeps changing. Uh, and by Chinese themselves, it's not by, that other people are questioning that. Uh, the Chinese refer to all the people around the Han, the valley area, as barbarians. And they refer to them as barbarians even as recently as the early 20th century. And that you can see the records of the Chinese dispatches from Lhasa. Again, they keep referring to them as barbarians. The fact is that in terms of civilization, all the people of the steppes, whether it is the Mongols or it is the Uzbeks, the Tibetans, the Manchus, they are different from their religion, their language, their culture is completely different from the civilization of the people in the plains. And historically, China has always been invaded by people from these parts, including by Tibet, incidentally, way back in the 7th and 8th centuries. And China always had this fear of being swamped by foreigners, as they called them. In fact, if you look at the Great Wall of China, which was the wall built by China to protect itself, that Great Wall of China passes practically through Beijing, whereas China claims all of Inner Mongolia and Mongolia itself. So it is a case of China trying to expand its territory in order to, of course, now it's for resources, but earlier it was to secure its borders. That the best way to secure the border is to conquer the territory outside so that you are safe and your homeland is not invaded by these barbarians. So that comes out fairly clearly in the Chinese narrative, which is why China is extremely rigid about its claim, which it bases upon the conquests of the Mongols and the Manchus.
Right. It's interesting you did bring up the Manchus, who were not Han Chinese and had actually been brought into the Tibetan Buddhist fold. But yet, even in contemporary times, you will often have advocates for China talk about the priest patron relationship that I believe existed from the fifth Dalai Lama onwards with the Manchu emperors. I believe, and forgive my pronunciation, might be wrong, the Cho-Yon relationship. Uh, you've discussed that Tibetans describe this relationship in ecclesiastic terms, yet Chinese sources tend to draw inferences regarding sovereignty. And there might be similar instances that you did find in the history. What do you think of these pre-Westphalian relationships? Do they really serve as a foundation for when it comes to sovereignty? Can inferences of sovereignty really be made from such a relationship to begin with?
Well, sovereignty is a very controversial term in international relations.
Right.
We don't know where sovereignty begins, where it ends, what establishes sovereignty. Eventually, as I've mentioned in this book and also in my earlier book when I dealt with Security Council, uh, sovereignty has to be claimed by a country and then asserted internationally. And the question whether it is recognized by other countries or not is moot. But it is not the defining characteristic of sovereignty. So, for example, in a certain way, you can say Taiwan today is sovereign because it is sovereign, but is not recognized internationally. So, in various international definitions, there are definitions of sovereignty where one gives a lot of importance to international recognition, and the other does not. The truth, of course, lies somewhere in between. And you must have a combination of both, because Taiwan, for example, because it's not recognized by, except for a very few countries, therefore it is not generally recognized as a member of it's not a member of the United Nations or as a sovereign separate country with which you have diplomatic relations. Then there are other countries, smaller countries like Kosovo, for example, which are recognized by a smaller group of countries, but it kind of exists as a country. Now, the problem with Tibet has been that Tibet has never really asserted its sovereignty. Um, the 13th Dalai Lama did do that, but then in 1951, when they signed even the 13th Dalai Lama, when he signed the Shimla Agreement in 1914, one of the articles in that agreement says that Tibet is under the sovereignty of China. Now, I don't know whether they really understood the implications of this or they just dismissed it as insignificant because China had actually, the Manchu Empire had collapsed at that time. Tibet was, there was no Chinese representative in Tibet. They had thrown out the Chinese army. So they were sovereign as far as they were concerned. So, but the British used these terms. One doesn't know what they explained to the Tibetans, who obviously would not have known English at that time, so what to see what they were signing. Um, so all these factors come in. Now, China, of course, uses all these arguments to establish its sovereignty over Tibet. But kings and emperors in the past, all emperors in India called themselves Shah Jahan, Jahangir, rulers of the whole world. That's how emperors describe themselves. But the reality is that whenever a foreign ambassador would come to China and present gifts, the Chinese records would state that such and such king from such and such kingdom sent his uh, uh, tribute to me, and therefore he is recognized as sovereign. This has been repeatedly mentioned in the Manchu Emperor's records. Now, China uses that, and it's most ironic that it's the Communist Party of China which uses the claims of the Manchus and the Mongols to assert its authority over Tibet and the other parts of Central Asia.
It's interesting you brought up the concept of China's suzerainty over Tibet, and how the British, in many ways, and you discussed this in your book, sort of insisted uh, on interpreting the relationship in that manner. And you particularly raised the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907, and according to you, that is when, I suppose, the real death knell for Tibet being recognized as a sovereign state happened. Everything seemed to snowball from there. But it is sort of interesting to discuss, why did the British insist on interpreting this relationship that way? There has been this argument made by some historians that the British always wanted Tibet as a buffer state against China, but you've actually explored these sources, and it seems that it was not China that it was meant to be a buffer against, but rather Tsarist Russia, with China sort of preventing there being a void of sorts that can be taken over. What is your view of this sort of disparity between these two arguments?
Well, the idea that the British wanted Tibet as a buffer between India and China is completely farcical. It's farcical because by the time the British got to know anything about Tibet, late 19th century, the Chinese Empire had become so weak that it survived at the mercy of the British mission in Beijing. In 1860, the British and French army had invaded and conquered Beijing. The emperor had fled. He died in exile. And then the British helped the Manchu Empire crush the rebellion of the Han Chinese called the Taiping Rebellion. Then it helped the Chinese army to reconquer Xinjiang. They helped the Chinese navy. So Britain was actually sustaining and supporting the, 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 the Chinese government at this time. So it could not possibly have needed any kind of a buffer between China and India. Britain's main threat was from Russia. And Russia had expanded into Central Asia. Russia had entered Central Asia well before Britain had. And Russia had established relations with Manchu China well before the British entered the scene. So when the British took Beijing in 1860, they realized that if the Manchu Empire collapsed, then the biggest beneficiary would be Russia, not Britain, because they were unfamiliar with Central Asia. They were unfamiliar with Afghanistan, with Tibet. Afghanistan, they had just been clobbered by the Afghans. So they were very scared of the interior of Asia and of trying to take on Russia in that area. Now, Russia also had its reservations because Russia was very stretched into Asia. The armies were very far from Moscow. Central Asia was under their control, but they were still scared of things there. So their rivalry was such that they came to some kind of an understanding, and Russia, particularly after the defeat to Japan in 1904, was much chastened and realized that it had to come to a compromise. And that compromise came about in 1907, where Russia agreed with Britain to draw a broad frontier in Asia, extending from Iran to Tibet, drawing a line between the Russian Empire and the British Empire. So Iran, Afghanistan, and Tibet were all decided upon. Afghanistan fell to the British. Iran was divided between Russian and British, and Tibet was given to China. Now, the reason for this was that Russia felt that the Chinese Empire was a good buffer, and it was better that Tibet was under China than under Britain. And Britain felt the same way. So there was a happy understanding between Britain and Russia on which way Tibet should go. So now that agreement, which established that Tibet would be under Chinese suzerainty, was honored by both Russia and Britain in 1950 when China invaded Tibet. Because, as you know, in 1997, the agreement was signed. Within 4 years of that, the Manchu Empire collapsed and Tibet declared independence. And then Tibet and China had some border skirmishes because Tibet tried to push the Chinese back to their natural frontier, which is the Yangtze River. And Britain intervened at this time to protect the Chinese because China was very weak at that time. And it established some kind of a peace between Tibet and China and actually helped the Chinese to retain their notional presence in Lhasa. The Chinese ambassador, for example, sent by Chiang Kai-shek, traveled through Calcutta and traveled back through Calcutta. So China's contacts with Tibet at this time had become very weak, and they were sustained essentially by the British. So Britain did want Tibet as a buffer, but as a buffer not with China, but with Russia.
And it's at this juncture I would also like to bring the contrasting case of Mongolia, which you've highlighted more than once in the book, which I feel is important, and I'm, of course, specifically talking about as what was then called Outer Mongolia. Now, of course, it is an independent republic. It had a similar relationship with the Manchu dynasty and also declared independence roughly around the same time, the collapse. You also talked about how Tibet and Mongolia recognized each other's independence. Why do you highlight this contrasting case? Why is Mongolia free today in the form of a sovereign state, whereas Tibet isn't? What was the difference?
Well, the title of the book is Imperial Games in Tibet. What I've tried to emphasize is that the fate of Tibet was decided by these imperial powers, primarily Britain and Russia, but China was also involved. And later on, although India was not an imperial power, India's policy also impacted Tibet. So the people of Tibet, the views of the people of Tibet were never taken into account. It were these imperial games that decided the fate of Tibet. I wanted to contrast this with Mongolia, which was in a fairly similar situation. It was also a part of the Chinese Manchu Empire. China still claims Mongolia as part of it. And yet, Mongolia became independent primarily because of the interplay of the imperial powers in this period. Now, the interplay was that for the British, the empire in India was paramount, was the most important thing. And they wanted to ensure that the safety of that by keeping Russia away from here. Now, Russia was also keen on getting control over Mongolia. Now, Britain did not regard Mongolia as being of any strategic value to it. So it agreed to Russia's claim that Mongolia should be left in the Russian sphere of influence because it didn't concern it much. But on Tibet, it was adamant that it would remain under Chinese control with some British presence, especially for trade purposes in Tibet. That was what Britain felt would be important for India's safety. Because of this, Mongolia went under Russian control. The Communist Party when the Communist Revolution took place there, the Communist Party came to power with Russian help. China kept claiming Mongolia, but Russia was able to keep China off. And after the Second World War, although there was a move to return all the conquests by Japan in Manchuria, Russia insisted that Mongolia would not go back to China. Even though just 4 years later, Mao came to power with Soviet help. But Moscow kept Mongolia under its control. And that became very fortuitous for Mongolia because when the Soviet Union collapsed, all the countries of Central Asia became independent, and so did Mongolia.
That is interesting. And following the Raj, when roughly around the same time, the Chinese Communist Party consolidated its rule in China and then turned its attentions towards Tibet. And you've also written in the book how there were indications that an invasion was imminent even before it actually happened. The Indian establishment was aware of it. Judging by your analysis of how the British treated Tibet, it almost seems like India also insisted on interpreting the relationship between China and Tibet along similar lines, albeit for perhaps different reasons that might have been more ideological than anything else. Yet there did seem to be diversity of opinion within the Indian establishment regarding China's intentions, not just over Tibet, but even India's frontier with Tibet. Um, you describe quite in some detail Nehru's envoy to the Chinese, K.M. Panikkar, and it almost seems like he might have had a bit of a damaging role to play in what transpired after. What do you think about some of the personalities of the time?
Well, yes, as you rightly point out, India pursued the same policy towards Tibet as the British, which is to recognize Chinese suzerainty over Tibet, but for different reasons. Uh, uh, the reasons why India did that was because India wanted to promote India-China relations as a means of as a Asian resurgence, the rise of Asia against European imperialism, and also because India felt that this new China was the new force of liberation for Asia, and also because there was this danger of a new world war breaking out over Korea and over Taiwan. And sorry, and Nehru wanted to ensure that India did not compromise its neutrality in this, so that India could play a positive role in mediation in the Korean War. So there were these various factors that came in to make India follow the British policy. But not everybody in India was convinced of this policy. Uh, Most importantly, our Deputy Prime Minister, Sardar Patel, our political officer in Sikkim, who was looking at things very closely. And there was this Englishman who was the last head of the, not the last level, he was the head of the Indian mission after the British India allowed him to continue till December 1950. And thereafter, Sumal Sinha took over. So all these people pointed out that the border between Tibet and India had never been defined. And therefore, since this border was open, allowing China to come in would expose India to territorial disputes with China. And some people also felt that China was actually being imperialistic in taking Tibet. So this dispute took place, and Panikkar is a colorful figure in India. He wrote this book, Asia Under Western Dominance, and he was a great intellectual. He had been sent to the Chiang Kai-shek government, but when Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan, he recommended that we be accredited to the new communist government, and he became greatly enamored of the communist. And I think he was also given a lot of importance by the Chinese, by Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, because they wanted to humor India at this time, because they realized that they needed India's support. So he was given a great deal of access, and he was completely taken in by this. With the result that when China attacked Tibet, he was speaking more on behalf of China and justifying China's action than representing India's viewpoint. And that is something that I managed to find in the archives, quite a bit of evidence of that, which was damaging for him and for us in the long run.
Indeed. And this actually brings me to a question that Ambassador Vinod Khanna poses uh, in praise for your book. What do you think the Prime Minister at the time, Jawaharlal Nehru, could have possibly done differently? Is there any way that he could have perhaps engineered a different outcome when it comes to Tibet?
Yes, there is the issue of what could India have done at that time. Now, there are two broad possibilities. One is military. Now, I believe militarily there was advice that India could not intervene militarily. I'm not a military expert, so I will not go into that debate. But quite certainly, the issue of recognizing Chinese sovereignty, or whatever over Tibet, that is a diplomatic issue. And we could have kept that open. There was no need for us to have so readily accepted uh, that Tibet was a part of China. Since, as China claims, this border dispute is a historical legacy left over by the imperial powers. So similarly was the status of Tibet, because after all, when did Tibet become a part of China under the Manchu emperors? Who were the Manchus? They were foreign conquerors, they were imperial power. They themselves called their empire an empire. So if the British were an imperial power, so were the Manchus. And the very fact that the Tibetans did not want the Chinese to come in. Tibet was an independent country till 1940, till 1951, actually. And when the Chinese forces moved into Chamdo, the Dalai Lama fled along with his entourage and came to Chumbi Valley. Now, if you are being liberated by a foreign power, you don't run away. You go and welcome those forces. Now, these are all things that were evident to us. Anybody who could see the developments there could see that the Tibetans were not happy to go under Chinese rule. Now, India's foreign policy was a foreign policy of speaking up for decolonization. India was fighting for Indonesia. India was fighting against apartheid in South Africa. Why did we not take up the cause of the Tibetans? After all, it's for the Tibetans to decide whether they are Chinese or not. It's not for the Chinese, not for Mao Zedong to tell us whether Tibetans are Chinese. And if the Dalai Lama and his entire entourage fled to Chumbi Valley, close to India's border, and they stayed there for almost a year until they realized that there was no help coming. Then they finally signed that agreement of May 1951. Then the Dalai Lama moved back in September 1951 to Lhasa.
That's right. So you find this approach was somewhat hypocritical, if not entirely, particularly when it comes to decolonization.
Yes, it was. It was. I think India failed to realize that imperialism wasn't just a European creation. It's not only Europeans who were imperial powers, there were other imperial powers as well in the world. And the People's Republic of China, although it came to be a communist country that was liberating people, it wanted to reconquer the entire Manchu Empire as it existed. And secondly, it also wanted to interfere in the internal affairs of other countries to liberate their people. But that is downright interference in the national sovereignty of other countries. And yet there were people, even including in India, who felt that, the leftists, the communists, they were great liberators. So they had a right to go and liberate the proletariat because the whole world was one. They didn't accept nationality. So many people were taken in by this kind of pseudo internationalism.
Your book ends on a rather bleak note. You talk about there being no end game in sight uh, as far as Tibet is concerned and in its quest for becoming a sovereign state. Yet you feel that there perhaps still is a role to be played by the Tibetan government in exile when it comes to perhaps achieving this end. However, there have also been interesting developments recently. We've had the Resolve Tibet Act passed in the US. So, what do you make of some of these developments? And do you foresee the Tibetan government in exile so progressing towards their stated aim any further than they have?
Well, the problem is that the stated aim of the Tibetan government in exile right now is to follow the middle path. So they are willing to talk to, in case Chinese government wishes to talk to them, for some kind of a compromise where some kind of autonomy is permitted to them. So that is the first part of the problem. As far as the US is concerned, you can see that while they have passed this act and they say that the status of Tibet should be determined under international law according to the wishes of the people of Tibet. At the same time, when President Biden signed this bill into an act, he said that the US recognizes Tibet as a part of China. Now, there was no need for him to say that. So you see these caveats all over the place, which makes it very difficult to say that there is even a straw in the wind to show that there is a direction, there's a wind direction in a certain direction. There's nothing at the moment. Uh, what is important for India is to understand that as long as Tibet was our northern neighbor for over thousands of years, at least 200 years of recorded history, it was a very friendly neighbor, and we never had even though the border was not demarcated, we never had a security threat coming out of Tibet, nor did Tibet face any security threat from India. But today, because of the presence of Chinese troops on the border, incidentally, the Chinese troops stationed themselves on the border of India only in the 1950s. It was only after 1952-53 the Chinese forces started coming close to the Indian border. In fact, they didn't even know where the border was. It was the Tibetans who took them to the border and showed them the border areas. And then China started preparing. China's first map came out, I think, 1959 something. They had no clue of what was the McMahon line. They had no clue about Aksai. I mean, so they drew up these maps later with Tibetan help, asking them where Tibetan territory ended. And so for our security, it's extremely important that we have a friendly power cross on the border and not a hostile power that claims all the Himalayan territory. But having said that, the fact remains that China today is a superpower, which no country is willing to take on. It's threatening Taiwan practically every day. And yet, being a permanent member of the Security Council cannot ask China to stop threatening Taiwan. It is threatening the smaller countries of Southeast Asia and South China Sea. It's threatening Japan, of course, is a much stronger power, but it's threatening Japan as well, violating its territorial integrity. So you have this extremely powerful country occupying Tibet, which no other power in the world is willing to take on at the moment. So that is what led me to conclude, that right now there is no end game in sight. I hope something positive comes up, but right now I can't see any indication of that happening.
Would you recommend any change to India's, I suppose, Sino policy or even Tibet policy, if you will?
Well, certainly to our Tibet policy, I think we should start rethinking our Tibet policy. We should start talking to the Tibetan government in exile, uh, whether as a human rights issue or as a right of self-determination issue. Tibet is important for India, and we have to keep in mind that the border that we have is with Tibet, not with China. China was never present at the border. So whatever agreements we have been, whether it is the one of the rulers in Himachal, the ruler of Jammu and Kashmir, they had signed a treaty with Tibet. Then the British had a treaty with Tibet in Shimla in 1914. So all these agreements have been with Tibet. So if we ignore Tibet and we eliminate it from our discussion, then we weaken our own case. So we have to revive the fact that whether we recognize Tibet as a part of China or not, Tibet has a place on the negotiating table.
Ambassador Sinha, that was very insightful. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
That was
Thank you.